Viktor Frankl and a fellow prisoner in Auschwitz made a pact. Each day, no matter how cold, no matter how hungry, no matter what had happened, they would find one thing to laugh about. It did not have to be funny in any conventional sense. It only had to generate a moment, however brief, of shared recognition of the absurdity of what they were living through. The moment did not protect them from the cold or the hunger. But Frankl came to believe it protected something else, the inner distance between themselves and their situation, the space in which they remained persons rather than simply victims. Humor, in Frankl's clinical and philosophical framework, is not a luxury or an escape. It is one of the primary expressions of what he called self-detachment, the uniquely human capacity to step back from one's own condition, to observe it from the outside rather than being entirely consumed by it. A person who can laugh at their own situation, genuinely, even darkly, has demonstrated that they are not identical with their situation. They are larger than it. There is a self standing at some inner distance from suffering, capable of perceiving it with a quality of perspective that suffering alone cannot supply. Frankl was specific about the mechanism. Humor works therapeutically because it activates self-transcendence from below rather than from above, not through the solemn, effortful, philosophically demanding act of choosing one's attitude in the face of suffering, but through the spontaneous, physical, involuntary rupture of laughter. The joke pulls the person temporarily out of their absorption in the problem. The laugh is itself the proof that there is a self available to be pulled out, a self with enough freedom left to find something ridiculous, even here. In the camps, humor took forms that would be incomprehensible to anyone who had not been there. Prisoners joked about the food that was barely food, about the guards who were both terrifying and absurd, about the bureaucratic machinery of horror that processed human beings with a kind of grotesque efficiency. The humor was dark, sometimes very dark, but its function was clear. It sustained the sense that the men making these jokes were still capable of perceiving reality from a human standpoint, still able to see the situation rather than simply being in it. Frankl connected this to his concept of paradoxical intention, the therapeutic technique of intending or exaggerating the feared symptom. What humor and paradoxical intention share is the element of performance. The person adopts a deliberate, exaggerated, slightly theatrical relationship to what is otherwise simply happening to them. In both cases, the adoption of this stance is an exercise of the same faculty, the capacity for self-detachment, and produces the same effect. The symptom or the suffering is encountered rather than fled, and in the encountering, the grip it had on the person is loosened. Frankl later developed humor as a formal therapeutic tool, recommending its deliberate cultivation not just as a coping mechanism but as a form of training in self-detachment. He suggested that patients with anxiety, particularly anticipatory anxiety, practice finding something absurd or darkly comic in the scenarios they feared. Not to minimize the fear, but to shift the relationship to it, to move from being the helpless subject of the feared experience to being an observer who can, from a slight inner distance, find in the same experience the quality of the ridiculous. The modern relevance is substantial. We live in a culture that oscillates between enforced positivity, the pressure to perform wellness and happiness, and the equally enforced seriousness of trauma-informed discourse in which humor about difficulty is treated as a dangerous minimization of real pain. Both positions miss what Frankl understood. Humor is not denial. It is not the claim that suffering isn't real. It is the assertion that the human being experiencing the suffering is more than the suffering, that there is a spirit present that can hold even the worst with something other than pure despair. This is why the people who have been through genuine extremity, veterans, survivors, people who have lived through serious illness, so often have a humor that people who have not suffered similarly sometimes find bewildering or inappropriate. They are not being callous. They have earned, through experience, the knowledge that the self can hold very hard things with a kind of spacious awareness that includes, in its periphery, the recognition that things can be terrible and absurd simultaneously. Frankl would recognize them immediately. They are practicing, without knowing his language, the very art he identified as one of the most important the human spirit possesses. Frankl's understanding of humor as a survival tool and a therapeutic technique offers a specific and practical gift to anyone living with chronic anxiety or persistent difficulty. The next time you find yourself caught in the loop of anticipatory fear, the mental rehearsal of what could go wrong, the vigilant monitoring of your own reactions, the desperate effort to control what cannot be controlled, try instead the Franklian move. Find something absurd in your situation. Not to minimize it, not to deny its difficulty, but to locate the small, ridiculous, fundamentally human quality of the predicament. Most difficult situations, seen with the right kind of distance, have something genuinely funny about them. The person who can find it, and laugh, even briefly and even darkly, has already exercised the inner freedom that the difficulty was threatening to take away. Subscribe to The Psychology of Viktor Frankl to explore more of his timeless ideas.